Happy heresies and welcome to the desert of the real. I know Adam liked that introduction and we'll
Way
introduce
cool.
that smiling the whole way through. So yeah,
Yeah.
we've passed our first test. Welcome everybody to AB Live. So happy to see you. Here we are in the desert of the real. This is not WandaVision. This is Sophia Vision because we're all trapped in some terrible bad software and some terrible Sopranos plot and whatever movies we were talking before the show started, our
Right.
meager lives. So welcome everybody. And yes, with us, we have the honor of being joined by Adam Dreesy. Adam, how are you?
It's great to be here, man. I'm super excited. Yeah, it's great. I'm doing great. Thank you.
It's great to have you on here at the Virtual Alexandria to discuss your book, Eden and Entheogens. And with
Yes.
us, too, we've got the Moondog Vance. Vance, how are you doing tonight or today or in this
Okay.
eternal now?
Well, I think I'm in California, but I'm actually trapped in New Jersey with The Sopranos.
Yeah, in a very weird sync, we've both been watching The Sopranos, rewatching
Yeah.
The Sopranos. So.
I grew up in Lodi, New Jersey. It's practically at the end credits. It's credited just about every episode. Lodi. I know all those towns, so
How
that's where
far
I
away are
really
you
am.
from Newark?
Newark, like a half hour or less.
That's it?
Yeah, Belleville. That was where my music store was. I used to go take saxophone lessons.
Yeah, I know. I know Newark because obviously there's a big Portuguese community these days. So stuff
Thorny
there.
Kirshner music. Yeah, Connie Francis went to my music store.
Very cool. Very cool. So welcome everybody. Again, we will be discussing, obviously, by the title of Adam's book, Entheogens in Ancient Times. Fascinating read. We will hopefully have some visuals as we go along, as the Spirit move us. I need more coffee. Should have had more coffee after dinner. As the Spirit moves us, and as always, if you have questions for Adam, please write them in all caps or lots of questions. Yeah, don't be shy. He's
don't be shy.
excellent. He's an excellent researcher, and his book covers so much, not just from the entheogens, but archaeology, anthropology, migration, ancient history, from Atlantis to the days of King David, even some other surprises beyond that. So it's very cool. And well, Adam, why don't we start? How did you come about to writing your book?
Well, yeah, probably a long story. I've always been curious about the Bible, I guess. So it's been something I've been interested in basically since I was a kid. So, but I guess, I don't know, somewhere along the line, I started thinking, maybe some of this is historical. And, so it's been years and years of kind of reading through the Bible and reading other stuff online and watching your show too, actually. And is that kind of process kind of put together a lot of things. And I just said to myself, I was going to try and write a book and put it all in this kind of condensed form, so that other people can access it too. And hopefully so that we can have these kinds of conversations about the role of entheogens in the past, and what that means concerning these religions today and all this stuff. So yeah,
awesome. And your book is not at bookstores. This is something everybody has access to it, and it's a living book.
Yes, it really is, actually. Yeah. So I've published this on the Internet Archive, so it's free for everybody. It's an ebook. I'm not selling it or anything. So it's something that I hope will be used as like a resource and maybe as a reference point for some people to look at this information and kind of get it all in just the simple parts in kind of one spot. And then you can go out and do more stuff too. So, and there's lots of room for other like additions to this material. So, yeah, that's kind of, so it is available freely on the Internet Archive. You're right. Yeah.
Well, we'll certainly have a link in the show notes for those of you who are interested. I highly recommend you get the book. As always, I should do a little house cleaning. There will be an audio version of this out in a couple of days. Some people ask me, well, what's the point and why do you do this? Well, the truth is less and less people want to listen on YouTube or Facebook. Some of you just want to stream your audio on your iTunes or whatever podcast provider you have. I'm one of those people. That's how I don't like to sit there on YouTube. Others are even more purists and just want to download an MP3 to your device. So I try to make these shows available in all forms and in different channels and so forth as the times go. So that's just me explaining things. But
Very good.
why don't we start with really the cornerstone of your book, Adam?
Sure.
And that is Terence McKenna and his stoned ape theory. Tell us about it.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I did kind of actually dedicate this to Terence McKenna. Because really it all starts with Terence, like you said. So I kind of build off of Terence McKenna's stoned ape theory, which many people listening are probably familiar with already, but for the sake of just conversation, I guess I can go through some of the points. So Terence supposed that early human beings evolved in the Sahara in Africa, and part of that evolutionary process was these people learning how to herd cattle, and then eventually, after herding cattle, they came about discovering these mushrooms, these hallucinogenic mushrooms, and that Terence thought that this might have been an agent for human evolution. And so I kind of take that point and I think about, okay, well, the Bible tells us about ancient Egypt, and there's some stuff with ancient Sumeria mixed in there. So, is it possible that Terence's stoned ape theory kind of went further into the future, and it didn't just stop all of a sudden with agriculture? Is it possible that maybe it's in the Bible somewhere? And that's kind of, I take that assumption, and it seems to be the case to me that, you can find this kind of mushroom religion in the Bible, actually in a couple different places. And yeah, I kind of use Terence's thinking as kind of roadmap for looking at the Bible and thinking about these early cultures, I guess, that they were kind of nomadic. They relied on cattle. And it's really quite similar to all the things that Terence talks about in his kind of imagining of what this kind of Saharan environment would have been like for these early primates, I guess, or sorry, early hominids, you could say. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. And we had last night our Finding Hermes Virtual Alexandria private meeting, and we had a leading researcher on psychedelics for our group. And I asked him, well, do you think Terence McKenna's ideas on what you're talking about still stand the test of time? He says, yeah. And I was like, well, that's amazing. After a generation, it still holds up. So good job, right, Uncle Terence.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, it's interesting. He's still kind of, he's hanging in there, and there's people been talking about the throwing arm that caused evolution, and there's a lot of different ideas, but Terence's theory still, I think it really has something to it, especially because you find these mushrooms are present in all these different religions in South America and everywhere. It's kind of, it makes sense as a historical narrative to me that this was a evolutionary agent, and it played a role in these early religions, and that this is probably related in some way to the kind of cognitive and civilizational development of these early cultures. And I think that you see that in the Bible, actually, in a pretty clear way. That's really interesting. It's a little bit complicated. We might not be able to get to all the pieces, as you guys know, but so we'll get to as much as we can. But the book will be kind of the best source to get all of the information.
Oh, indeed. I mean, these interviews they're an appetizer. They're a taste. You're not going to get the whole thing with
right
one podcast, even if it's 2 or 3 hours. It is what it is. But
yep, that's true.
That's the whole point. Well, before we get to the evidence, and there's a quote you use by Terence McKenna: "We don't need the truth. We just need something that is true enough." I love that.
Yes.
And,
yes. Yep.
And with Terence, he was able to. Basically, it's not like he looked at one section. He saw society and culture around the world. Like he would see Peruvian tribes and their habits, religious habits, and so forth. And he saw that there was a universal aspect to ancient humans, how they behave. So it was very logical to see that what people did in the Middle East was what they did in other parts of the humans are humans.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, he kind of took that universalist approach. Yeah, yeah, it definitely makes sense too. I think. Yeah, humans are humans. Yeah, make that. That's well put. Yeah,
Or humans are just monkeys
yeah,
copies.
maybe that too. I don't know. Yeah, yeah,
And you before you even before you even get into the entheogens, you talk about two important symbols that really are the foundation of human consciousness, and one is the serpent, and one is the sacred feminine, which appears obviously in the Old Testament in the form of Eve. Why do you bring these two symbols up early in your book, Adam?
yeah. That's a good question. So yeah, is big in Terrence's worldview too, especially concerning this kind of part of the prehistory and all that stuff. The sacred feminine is kind of obvious. I mean, it's it's well, maybe not obvious, but the reason. Sorry, I have to think about how I'm going to phrase this. It these primitive cultures were a lot different than how we think today. I think just by looking at this literature, you can kind of see that there's a lot of different sentiments about the way that they look at the world. And one of them is the reverence for the sacred feminine. Some of the first forms of like primitive human culture are like the formation of these like goddess figurines, right? And so then you have the symbolism too with Eve in the Garden of Eden. Obviously, she's kind of demonized in the kind of contemporary narrative about how and I kind of go through some of the analysis on why I think that was. Basically, I thought it was propaganda. Essentially, it was given out to the masses. These women and these serpents are evil. Stay away from them. So this would have been maybe the Garden of Eden, and the serpent symbolism was probably related to this psychedelic drug use. And especially in the Garden of Eden story, what you have is a kind of like primitive propaganda where you have priests who are saying, these women, these serpents, they're evil. Don't have anything to do with them. This is for the priests. This is for the people who know about things, and this is for the government officials. So that's kind of how I frame the Garden of Eden story. There's other ways to look at it, of course, too, but I think that's one interpretation that kind of works for it.
Yeah. The shroom of knowledge.
Yeah, well, essentially, yes. Yeah, I mean, yes, yeah. Yeah, because I kind of follow Terrence on this. If these mushrooms kind of helped grow the brain size of these early hominids, then this really just makes sense that this would actually help people think. This would help people think about things, even in terms of government. And yeah, it's kind of goes counter to what we talk about today. A lot of people say that these drugs are, somehow cognitively like deteriorative. They'll rot your brain or whatever. I don't think that's the case. It doesn't seem to me to be the case because of how present this stuff is in these old cultures, and that it was used by the governing officials especially, and they were doing some pretty amazing things. So I don't necessarily see it that way.
But I think what we can agree on is at some point, these drugs, psychedelics, this feminine serpent worship, very primordial, very lunar, very magical. I guess Jordan Peterson would say chaotic.
Sure.
It wasn't a good basis to build a reasonable, proper, logical civilization. So basically, the entheogen use had to be narrowed down to the priesthood or the king. The divine feminine had to be taken away, and not even then. I mean, as they said, whenever the cult of Yahweh took over, it wasn't just Asherah who got thrown out, but all the other temples of Yahweh that were outside of Jerusalem got leveled. It was like, we are going to have one centralized government, and this was normal with other civilizations, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You get that kind of authoritarian, like legalism that kind of takes over eventually. But I think when these things start out, when these religions and these movements start out, it seems to me that they start out pretty psychedelic and pretty nature mystical and all that stuff. But eventually you kind of get these legalists who maybe don't take the psychedelic drugs, and they don't, or if they do, they don't want anybody else taking it because they see it as a source of power. and so that's about keeping power to yourself. And so what ends up happening is, you get these authoritarian regimes, I guess, that start popping up. But there's these kind of two different kind of governing models that kind of spring up. You have this kind of agrarian governing model. It's all about administration and rule and telling other people what to do. And then you have this kind of decentralized nomadic kind of mushroom religion that seems to be kind of pretty involved in these early Israelite stories in the Bible. So,
And what do you think of what do you think you deal with it in your book, the myth or the story of Cain and Abel?
Yes, Cain and Abel. Yeah, that's another one. I like that you're touching on these older myths. They're interesting. It's hard to parse out exactly what it might mean, but I give a few interpretations in the book. Cain and Abel, I think, is another form of propaganda in a sense. So the story of Cain and Abel is that it's Cain that basically is an agriculturalist, and Abel is this kind of nomadic pastoralist. I think I'm getting that right. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Miguel.
Yeah, no, yeah. Sure Cain was the farmer, some say vegetarian.
Yes,
vegan,
right.
Whatever.
Yeah, he was the vegan. No, he was the agriculturalist, right? So and then Abel was this kind of nomadic pastoralist, and Abel offers a meat offering to Yahweh, whereas Cain offers an agricultural offering to Yahweh. And Yahweh basically says, I don't want your agricultural produce. I like Abel's offering of the meat. And so Cain becomes like, he's refused by Yahweh. So then Cain gets jealous of Abel and he kills him. And then he becomes judged and banished. And so this seems to me to be some kind of propaganda leveled against the agricultural way of life in the Old Testament. It's pretty similar, actually, to what Terence McKenna talks about, how the agriculturalists would kind of fall out of this kind of nature mysticism. And they'd stop, using mushrooms. They'd stop participating in this kind of old archaic religion. So Yahweh in this way is kind of this god of this pastoralist mushroom religion, and he likes Abel's offering because he's a nomadic pastoralist, probably eating mushrooms, and he doesn't like the offering from the agriculturalist because he's just this serf. And so it's a form of propaganda to keep the Israelites in a nomadic state of existence where they're living off their cattle and they're flexible and they're not beholden to any of these kings in Egypt or in Canaan. So that's the way that I interpret the general myth of Cain and Abel. But
with Cainites, it's a polemic against the Cainites. Obviously, what's the other?
Sure. Yeah.
I always love the interpretation that Cain was the first vampire.
Cain was the first vampire. I haven't heard that.
And the mark of Cain was to protect. I don't know.
Oh, I don't know.
Story. Maybe it's a story I was going to write. I don't know.
Oh, maybe. Okay. Yeah, sure.
I don't know if you guys ever saw Dracula 2000, where Dracula, the first vampire, is actually Judas Iscariot. Because remember, he killed himself at night. The silver. Yeah, good flick. Forget who plays Dracula. Who's the guy from 300? King Leonidas. What's the name of the actor?
Gerard Butler.
Yeah, Gerard Butler plays Dracula in Dracula 2000. So.
Okay.
We all need a source story, even beyond the Bible. That's just it is. So, well, awesome. Well, yeah, it's good to see these ancient myths because again, we see the foundation of the consciousness of these old people, as well as why they did things, or underneath the hood, geopolitics, cultural movements, and so forth. So, well, why don't where do you want to start, Adam? Would you want to start out where in the Bible we start seeing entheogens, or do you want to talk about how these cultures came about, the similarities of these cultures? Because you do a great job showing how the Phoenicians were so similar to the Canaanites and the Hebrews, and they basically had much of the same rituals, and they were all sort of ecstatic, shamanistic in the Bronze Age and before. So let me know what's a better starting point for you.
Well, I think a good starting point is just to maybe explain the very basic part of the whole Israelite story and how it starts with Abraham, just to give people this, if they don't know the Bible or whatever, then they can kind of know how this kind of just starts out. So basically, I kind of do that mythological interpretation in the beginning, but then once you get to Abraham, you kind of have some more historical basis for looking at this to say, okay, this might be something that actually happened. It might not just be a story. The other things might be real. I don't know. But the Abraham stories, it's about people going to certain places. And so it becomes more historical. So Abraham in particular, he starts out in Sumeria. He goes up into Anatolia in Turkey. And then he goes down through Canaan into Egypt. And so he kind of does this tour of the Fertile Crescent, really, in the very beginning of the story. And so and then this is where he gets the promise from God that the Israelites are going to inherit the land of Canaan. That's kind of where this happens and where this mythology comes from for the Israelites, that God promised them that they would inhabit this country, that they would live here. So that starts with Abraham, and then he has a couple kids, and then they have some kids, and it keeps going on, and you end up with this big tribal group that is descended from a person named Jacob or Israel, and it's basically these are the Israelites. They descend from Jacob's kids. So it's pretty simple, and the Bible gives you actually a pretty clear and simple record of how it started with Abraham and kind of went on. So. And it shows too, what's interesting is it kind of shows how they ended up in Egypt. And this is through this whole drama of the story of Joseph, who was supposedly a seer in ancient Egypt.
But before we get to Joseph,
sure,
there's a section in your book, I don't know why this makes me laugh, where you talk about the mushroom cult might have been the circumcision, because once you circumcise men, their penises look like mushrooms.
Yes, I think it might have been the case. I don't know, but essentially,
you don't find this funny, Vance?
Vance
he doesn't want to say it.
Yeah, I was looking at the chat. I missed it. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the circumcision ritual, it may be just like tattooing, where you have symbolic scarification. The circumcision ritual may have been a way of signifying that you're a part of a mushroom cult in the Middle East. It's really simple kind of mythology. And in the Bible, it says, you only perform circumcision on men. This isn't something that you do to women. So, right. So yes, it's a phallic ritual. So I see it that way, that it might have been connected to this, because the Egyptians also do circumcision. So
I think it was their upper class only, though. I think
perhaps you're right about that. I haven't looked too much into the Egyptian side of it, but
is that why the capstones are missing from the pyramid?
Yes, they are. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know much about the whole ancient Egyptian pyramid thing. Honestly, that whole Egyptian pyramid thing just freaks me out. It's so interesting. How the hell did those get there? I have no idea. So I'm sorry, I don't have answers for that. For people who want to read my book, I have no answers for the pyramids. Sorry, but let's
go back to mushroom penises.
Yeah, I could do. Yeah, let's go back to mushroom penises. Exactly. I love it. I love it. So
that's basically the first hint that there might be a mushroom cult that we can see.
I think so. Yeah, I think with Abraham, you kind of get that, just that brief glimpse. And Abraham also has some visionary experiences where he lays down and he has this dream, and it freaks him out apparently. And so he sacrifices some animals, and it's just this weird story. And then with I think it's with Jacob, he does this thing where he puts poplars in this body of water where his sheep are eating. So apparently this was to make the sheep breed more, and it was to expand the flock and to kind of grow his wealth. And that was also a big part of these primitive cultures. This is how you got rich, is by having a big flock of sheep, and you could trade those and do whatever you wanted with them, and you could move them around. It was a way to
horny
get rich,
sheep. It was good to have horny sheep.
Yeah, and horny sheep at that. Yes, because then they'd have more sheep. So.
All right.
Yeah, so that's kind of.
You were talking about Joseph, right? Yeah.
What's that?
Okay, yeah, go on. You were talking about Joseph, or wherever you want to go.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, So I don't know. So essentially, yeah. So you have Abraham, you have Jacob, and they kind of have some kind of vague drug symbolism and stuff. But it starts to get more detailed as you go on. It gets more detailed with Moses. But you want to kind of explain how Moses gets to Egypt in the first place. How do these kind of Canaanite groups get to Egypt? And that happens basically through Joseph. So Joseph's basically sold into slavery by his brothers. They're all kind of jealous of him. And what ends up happening is he's bought as a slave in this kind of royal Egyptian family, and he's kind of trained to be this administrator, essentially. And he ends up kind of seducing, I guess, the wife of his master unwillingly, is the way that the Bible says it. But she just became obsessed with him and became very attracted to him, and she ends up accusing him of adultery, essentially. And so Joseph gets sentenced to prison. He spends a long time there, and he builds this reputation of interpreting dreams, which is kind of interesting, that he can like predict the future by interpreting dreams. All these prisoners have these dreams, and they ask him what it means. Eventually, the Pharaoh hears about the Pharaoh of Egypt hears about this and says, "Oh, bring this guy into my court. I have this dream that nobody can explain." And so Joseph gets summoned into the Pharaoh's court, and this is where you have that story of what is it? There's like 7 cows grazing by the Nile. They're all healthy. And then 7 sickly cows come up and devour these healthy cows. And the same thing happens with grain. You have these 7 stalks of healthy grain, and these 7 stalks of unhealthy grain kind of take over the healthy grains. And Joseph interprets this to mean that you have 7 years of good crops, and then you have 7 years of crop failure. So what you have to do is build these grain silos, and that's going to save the Egyptian empire, essentially. So this interpretation works, and even if it wasn't true, you could say, well, it's a kind of smart idea just to build grain silos anyways, because you're probably going to have crop failures eventually. And so he builds these these grain silos, and he becomes this administrative official in Egypt, essentially. And then he has this whole kind of dramatic reunification with his family members, which is really kind of touching story. I think it's really interesting story. But then they end up settling in the Nile Valley, essentially. So that's how these Israelites get into Egypt. And then from there, they have kids, and they build this big tribe, and eventually they get enslaved. And that's kind of when Moses comes along. So that kind of sets up the whole circumstance for how Moses gets into the Israelite story in Egypt. Yeah. So
awesome. Yeah. And just for me to set the backdrop, again, our meeting last night, I was talking about Cherry S's book, or Dia Murdoch wrote a book about Moses, and she does an excellent job of paralleling Moses and Yahweh to the cult of Dionysus and Bacchus. In other words, she proves that this was the Hebrews were initially an ecstatic group that believe in intoxicating visions and all that. And when you read the Bible, it's like, no, there's nothing. But like right. You, Adam, once you look underneath and you look at the symbolism and the hints, like words like milk, and you realize, and the rituals, how you tie them into other godmen, ecstatic, mystic godmen, you're like, whoa, these guys were party animals. I mean, they were communing with the stars and all that. So, yeah. Tell us about the most obvious Moses as a shaman evidence that we have.
Yeah, sure. I suppose we could get some pictures maybe from Vance on this. Do you have those pictures, Vance? I don't know.
No, I don't have them set up. Yeah, Miguel does.
Oh, Miguel does. Okay, I got you.
Let me find them here. Then we'll do a screen share.
Sure. I'm going to open up my phone so you can see too.
All right.
Who put the brew in Hebrew, huh?
Right. That's a good question. That's great.
Yes. It's like my friend, they put his Twitter gender, Hebrew. He's Jewish, but all right. Great. Let's see. Share screen. Screen share with 2 monitors.
That was a good point you were bringing up, though, Miguel, about how it's so often interpreted that these religions are super authoritarian, And, if you take a second look at it, you can kind of see that it might be a little bit more kind of groovy than you might have thought in the first place,
Man, how is it? Do you see it?
It's flickering on my screen.
Flickering. All right. Okay, I see it. All right. Do you see it now? Has it stopped flickering?
I see. Yeah, there's no flickers, and I see your backdrop basically. In Search of Incredible, which is what we're doing.
All right.
Yes,
okay.
That's better.
All right. Which one?
Yeah, so I guess we can talk about the one thing I was thinking I wanted to talk about, actually, for Vance, because you have this Moondog nickname that I don't know what the origin story of that is, so maybe I need to hear that first. I don't know.
The Moondog, among other people probably in history, was a street musician in New York City in the 50s and 60s. And I used to watch the Alan Burke Show all the time, and I saw him on the Alan Burke Show. This is a New York area. Okay. And that's where the most famous Moondog comes from. But whenever anybody asks me, well, who are you really, or what's your real name, or whatever, the word Moondog would pop in my head. So one day I said, you know what? That's my name, really. My real name was my given name. So there you go.
That's great. Well, there's some interesting lunar symbolism in Moses's story that I think you might be into. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, let's see.
Yeah. There's also a connection with the moon and the divine feminine, and moon dogs are kind of these interesting optical phenomenon that happen around the moon under certain conditions. So it's kind of like you're orbiting the divine feminine, which means something to me personally.
Sure. There you go. Yeah. So I guess we'll kind of fast forward through Moses' story and get basically to the Exodus, which is the big kind of Charlton Heston moment where he parts the Red Sea.
But we should, even before that, we should also talk the burning bush. That is an obvious psychedelic ritual. Yeah. It wasn't, the smoke and all that. And then obviously the snakes and Aaron with the snakes. I mean, we have this whole magic psychedelic vibe.
That's
going
true.
On the whole story.
Yes. Yeah, and then Yahweh stoned him, right?
Yeah, that's it.
The tablets, stoned tablets.
Right. The stone tablet.
Sorry.
Theory. Yes, I love it. Okay. I love it. Yes, you're right, Miguel. See, yeah, I'm skipping ahead. That's a good point. The whole burning bush thing's kind of interesting. So Moses basically he's born and raised in this kind of Egyptian royalty. He sent down the basket. He sent down a river in a basket, just like Sargon the Great in ancient Sumer. So some people say that this story's fake because it's copying Sargon the Great. Well, it might just be a kind of cultural appropriation to just quickly explain his adoption by this Egyptian government. Hard to say exactly what it is, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's false, in my opinion, at least. So you have Moses kind of growing up in this royal Egyptian household, and he's kind of like some kind of administrator overseeing the Israelites who are kind of working as slave laborers. And essentially what ends up happening, he realizes his kinship to the Israelites, and he basically defends some slave worker is one version of the story, and he ends up killing an Egyptian citizen, and he has to leave. He's exiled basically because it's like a capital offense. He'd be killed for doing something like that. So it's this pretty intense political drama going on in Moses's life. But where he goes is kind of interesting. He goes to this place called Midian, and Midian is supposedly another descendant of Abraham, so a close tribal relationship to the Israelites. Basically, he goes to this territory that these kind of this familial tribe lives, and he learns from this priest named Jethro. He's kind of brought in to his family, and he marries this priest's daughter. And this is where he has his experience with the burning bush. Interesting that that he has this experience in this place, Midian, because you have other mushroom symbolism that happens later at the same place. But it's also interesting because he's with this kind of nomadic group, and this guy's apparently a priest. His father-in-law is apparently a priest, and then he has this experience with the burning bush, and it's this totally hallucinogenic trip is what it is. And what's interesting is right before he has the burning bush kind of hallucination, the Bible kind of sets up some interesting circumstances. You have basically Moses tending the flock of his father-in-law. This is what it says right in the Bible, right before he has this trip. So some people say that, well, the bush was an acacia bush and it was on fire and it was DMT and he was getting high off the DMT fumes. I don't necessarily think that would work, just logistically speaking. DMT, if you're going to smoke it, you got to get a lot of it. So, I don't see the open air situation working so well there. But he's tending a flock of sheep in this kind of nomadic territory. Could have been that there were mushrooms growing there and he just ate the mushrooms as a part of this old tradition that goes back to the Sahara. So that's what I think probably happened if this story is historical. And then basically too, you have the burning bush. The bush is on fire, but it's actually not burning, is the way that the Bible puts it. So he's hallucinating already when he's looking at this bush. He's already tripping. He's already taken these drugs. So that's the way that I frame the whole burning bush experience. But then you get this kind of revolutionary message from Yahweh where he says, I'm going to use you as the instrument to free the Israelites. And, it's really this amazing kind of spiritually edifying message, to bring the Israelites into a state of independence and self-governance and to free them from slavery. It's it's a kind of wonderful story, I think, in that way. But in the fact that it might be facilitated by these hallucinogens is another interesting layer of this that, it just adds, like, there's so many connotations here. It's just really interesting. But and then so that he also there's so many hallucinogenic things in that. You can read through the book to kind of get that. But
for the audience, Adam goes blow by blow with the passages and what to look for, words like milk and other, they were probably doing something mind-altering substances. I guess the question would be, people might be listening or watching and they might be going, what are these guys high? They're in the desert. What are mushrooms in there? Can you explain why that whole area was perfect for mushrooms or other psychedelics?
Yes. So this area, the Bible describes this region, the Midianite territory. Later in the scriptures, it tells us that this was a wilderness and that it wasn't a desert. There's some mistranslation that happens with the New International Version and a couple other versions that say it's a desert. It doesn't translate the underlying Hebrew correctly. The underlying Hebrew word is midbar. I might be mispronouncing that. I've only read it, but what it means is an unoccupied place where cattle go to graze. That's what the underlying Hebrew word means. So this would have been a grassland at the very least, somewhere where you can bring your sheep and your cows to eat grass. So that's how this area is described in the Bible. It wasn't a desert at that time, at least, or so that's the way that the Bible tells us that it was. And John Anthony West and a few other people have gone into some details about the Sphinx being weathered by water erosion. This could have happened pretty recently, as early as 6,000 years ago. It could be longer back than that. I'm not saying anything definitive about when the Sphinx was created, but the Sahara in the Middle East was much more fertile back in those days. So,
wow, very cool.
Yeah.
And I'm going to have one more question, then I'm going to throw it to Vance and the audience because I am seeing some questions there. But obviously, the obvious one, besides the burning bush, the visions, what was growing then, of course, is manna from heaven. That should be one anybody could, even though it's been such a mystery, I think in this context, you could knock this one out of the park.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. Thanks, man. So there's a lot of interpretations out there, and I've followed Danny Nemu for a little bit now.
I love his work.
Yeah, same. Yeah.
He's been a guest several times. Yeah.
Yep. So I know that he has a different idea of this, and so there's a couple different ideas, but to me, I think that the manna was probably psilocybin mushrooms. And another thing maybe worth noting before we get too much further into this is, it's kind of important to recognize that European scholars who come back and look at this tradition are going to miss the tropical mushroom symbolism because, going back to 1600s, 1700s, when people were writing and translating the Bible, they didn't have much of a knowledge about these tropical mushrooms. It would have been pretty minimal. So they, in some cases, they would miss things and they'd mistranslate things here and there. So that's one reason why this might get lost, just so that some people know, it's kind of hard to believe that people would miss this symbolism. And for me, at least, once I started reading through this, it was like almost hard to believe that this had been missed for so long. But I mean, there's lots of people who have also made these same assertions too, that, manna was probably a psilocybin mushroom. This has been a kind of popular theory going back for a while. I discovered it quite a while from, I can't even remember where. It was some cool 1990s web page from back in the day, I don't know. So, yeah, so other people have supposed this as well. But I guess we could show the hoarfrost image to kind of give a sense of kind of just what this stuff would have looked like.
I'm going to do my share screen.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Do you remember which number it was?
It was number 15.
Yep. 15. Let me whip out 15. Sinai evidence. Everybody see this?
Sorry. Maybe it's. Oh, I don't know. It's.
We're not seeing it as a full picture, Miguel.
I'm sorry.
That's.
Oh, you don't.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's not.
There it is.
Here we go. Yeah, that's better.
All right.
There it is.
So this is hoarfrost. Cool.
Yes. So in the Old Testament, in Exodus, after the Israelites cross over from the Red Sea, you have Moses wandering around again in this Midian territory where his father-in-law lived, and they start describing this magic food that comes out of a cloud, and they don't really know where it comes from. They're kind of not sure what it is, and they say that it grows on the ground like hoarfrost. And one of the really interesting things about psilocybin mushrooms is, it really does look like frost. You can see on the top there are some images of frost there, and then on the bottom you have those images of the psilocybin mushrooms in their mycelial networks, which really look very similar to this kind of frost that is used in the Old Bible there. So in the King James version, which I used for my translations. So it's really very similar looking material. I think it's kind of very, very clear to me that this it's very plausible. They're talking about mushrooms because, again, they're in a tropical climate. So if it does snow much there, it's not very often. It maybe in the mountains somewhere, but in a tropical climate, and they see frost, you kind of have to wonder if they're talking about mushrooms, and it makes sense to me. The next image there is the coriander seeds, number 16. And this is another thing that's referenced in the Bible. It says that it appeared on the ground small like coriander seed, that the manna appeared on the ground small. And you can see the early stage of growth for these mushrooms is, it looks like coriander seed. That's exactly what it looks like. So it's very, very reasonable to assume that the Israelites are describing mushrooms here. And another reason to think this too is that the Israelites had left their agricultural lifestyle in Egypt. They had been slaves working this agricultural empire, and then they basically take all these cattle with them when they leave, because they're going to become nomads and they're going to learn how to live like Moses' father-in-law. And so they have cattle pooping everywhere, and poop is the nutrient substrate for these mushrooms, particularly cow poop. And so that you have these mushrooms, or what appears to be hoarfrost and coriander seed and all of these symbols that seem to be telling us that, they had encountered these mushrooms. And then Moses goes on to say, okay, now you have to eat this stuff every single day. This is where it just gets wild. It gets crazy. So it's, I don't know. It's pretty funny. So Yeah, and he also tells them that you have to preserve this on Saturday, or well, it's not the same day system that we have today, but essentially before the Sabbath, you have to preserve an extra batch because you're not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath. And the way that he tells them to preserve it is either by baking it, or by boiling it in water. And that's a good way to preserve mushrooms. You dry them out by baking them, or you put it in a tea. So that's Moses tells them basically to preserve these mushrooms in a way that works, So
very cool. Yeah, good.
That's
good argument. For those who have joined a little late, we got Adam Dressy discussing his book Eden and Entheogens. And just wanted to say a quick timeout. I always forget to do public service announcements beyond support the show, support our guests, support alternative media, because the old ways ain't working and things ain't getting better. Black old sun, won't you come? Or it's enveloping the world. But I also wanted to say I am, as some of you may know, I am offering my voice for voiceover projects. So if you have an audiobook, a commercial, a video game, anything else, I am here. I've got the home studio. I've already done a couple of audiobooks. I've done some work for a alternative Christian church, done a poetry book, and done even a couple of commercials. So putting it out there, if you need my voice, which people tell me I have a good voice, except for my family, kids and wife, for some reason, don't agree with the public, but what do they know? They just know me. Anyway, Vance, do you have a question, or is there any questions from the audience?
Well, yeah. Nowadays, I don't know about Jewish law, but are mushrooms kosher now? That's leading up to something.
That's actually a good question. I don't really know about all the different sectarian laws and rules that exist now. I couldn't answer it.
Yeah, because in the days of Moses, that was before all those laws that came later in the Bible, right? And so the
Noah died laws or something, but then came the
So I'm wondering if, obviously, in the later days of Judaism, they didn't have as much emphasis on the entheogens as you're saying that they did in the Mosaic times, right? Because it seemed to have faded out. And maybe that came with the laws of the Torah. That's when they started restricting what they could eat, so forth.
Could be, yeah. There are some groups that do prohibit mushroom use too. The Mandaeans come to mind. So, in some cases, a mushroom prohibition actually, I think, might be an indication that the priests were taking it and they were telling everybody else not to.
Make something illegal unless it's already been done by somebody, and like you said, need to bring it to you.
That's right. They're eating ham sandwiches back there in the back room too, right behind the curtains.
Exactly. Yep. Or the CIA and cocaine. I don't know.
Yeah. It's always the way, right?
Yeah. I don't know. So that's one way to look at it, but I'm not totally sure.
Okay. Fair enough. Another thing, though, more to the deeper point. Do you think that the entheogens are basically, maybe this is obvious, but opening a path to other realms and other beings that we can't, in our materialistic mode, can't speak to? In other words, like Moses talking to Yahweh, right? And so maybe that's what the whole function of these substances is, entheogens, right? In order to open the channel, open the path. Is that the model you think that we're dealing with here?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's something to do with something like that for sure, where, there's some access to some kind of information outside of ourselves, I think, in some capacity. I don't have a good explanation for it. I mean, frankly. You have James's theory of the bicameral mind. Some people might be familiar with this. It's a little bit more fringe, but that, you had this kind of early people had kind of, their minds were kind of fractured into two separate kind of brains, I guess. You had the God brain on one side, and you had the kind of body brain on the other side, and the God brain would tell the body brain what to do all the time. So he abstracts this concept of gods into this kind of two-sided mind, I guess. So it might just be giving us access to something inside of ourselves that maybe we don't have access to. It might be some kind of ability to look at the world more clearly. I don't know. It's open for debate, but it seems to be that there's some transcendental experience going on with these old figures. And, if you take it yourself, I think in some cases, most people come back saying that there's something going on with this stuff. I mean, from what I've heard, at least. So, yeah.
Yeah. And one of the viewers, OG Tab, and we haven't had a lot of questions either. Miguel, have you seen many questions go by? I saw one.
Somebody was asking about Atlantis and Sumeria, but I want to do that at the end of the show, because Adam's research on Atlantis is pretty, I thought.
Fun.
I want to go a little bit more through the Babel and ancient people before
Great.
Go full on Atlantis.
Yes. Yeah. We'll get there, though. We'll get there.
Okay. All right. Well, that's all I got.
So carry on, my wayward son, as Kansas say. So we got Moses, and again, you show a lot of evidence. For the viewer, we will only get to maybe 5% of the evidence. It's quite a bit, but I'm interested in David and Solomon, specifically David, because again, you read the Bible how you're taught in church and Sunday school, but when you look at David and Saul, you take off your lenses and the program, and you go, man, these guys were some Dionysian motherfuckers. Because David will start singing, and the Spirit of the Lord, and he'll go on a trance and take off his clothes in front of everybody, and just the Israelites are like, when a shaman has a vision, you just let him do it. Naked shamans happen a lot in northern Africa and other places. They walk around and you just kind of back off. They're Muslims ones, they're pagan ones, but David is a huge Dionysian follower, and so is Saul. So tell us about evidence about, obviously they were in altered states of mind, and that was part of the vibe of those days in Israel. But what are some clues that they might have been taking psychedelics or mushrooms, Adam?
Yeah, there's a few things. It's
pardon my language. I got carried away because
oh my
God, David is like a rock star. He's like Robert Plant or something.
Exactly. I mean, that's the way I see it. Totally. Yeah, exactly. So there's a couple different things. That story you're just telling about David is when he's doing. Basically, they're transporting the Ark of the Covenant between these two locations. And there's this big procession, and they're passing out wine and food, and there's all of this is this kind of celebration going on around the Ark of the Covenant. And David gets kind of into this trance state, and he dances, and he kind of strips himself naked. And his wife criticizes him, and he's like, "Why are you dancing like this in front of everybody?" She's like criticizing him for being a party animal, basically. But there's an interesting connection here to the manna that I don't think always gets picked up on. So in those early days with Moses, you had a prescription that Aaron and all the high priests were supposed to keep a jar of manna next to the Ark of the Covenant all the time. So because of that, you might ask yourself, well, what if this was a ceremony with the Ark of the Covenant? They might have been carrying this jar of manna with them, this jar of these mushrooms, and David might have just took a few out and ate some, and started dancing. I don't know, man. Yeah, I don't know. So it's an interesting symbolism. If the manna is some kind of psychedelic drug, it would have been there with the Ark of the Covenant, according to the laws of the old Israelites. That was how it was done. Saul is interesting. Again, it's a lot of it's kind of insinuation, because after you kind of learn that the Israelites might have been taking this stuff, it kind of sets the foundation, and you can kind of look forward at David and Saul as kind of being a part of this kind of nomadic group and continuing this tradition. One of the things was this moment with Jonathan, Saul's son, that's kind of interesting. Basically, before he goes and sieges this fortress or something, he kind of the Bible tells us that he dips his rod in some honey. This is what the Bible tells us. So he's with a troop of soldiers probably, and they're in this forest, and he apparently dips his rod in this honey, and then he lifts it up to his mouth, he eats it, and what it tells us is that his countenance became enlightened. This is the English way that they put it. There's a couple ways you could translate it, but essentially, I'm curious if essentially this milk and honey symbolism that we see in the Old Testament, I think that it might be possible that this is a reference to psilocybin mushrooms in particular. And the reason is that basically this might be an occult way of explaining what these mushrooms look like, essentially. So you have these milky white stalks and this milky white mycelium, and then you have these honeycomb kind of caps with this geometry on the bottom. It just makes sense that this primitive group would look at this stuff and they would call it milk and honey. So the land of milk and honey is the land of milk and honey because there are psilocybin mushrooms there. And that's why the Israelites want to own this land, because that's where all the mushrooms grow. So it's an interesting interpretation of why they're so adamant about conquering this land. And they have these wars over it, and everyone's fighting for it. I mean, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, everybody wants to have this territory. And it's also a kind of fertility indicator. These mushrooms will grow in tropical places, so this means that these territories would be good for agriculture, essentially. So it'd be a good place to own if you were a big group of people. So that's my kind of interpretation of what milk and honey means. And then it kind of, when you look at milk and honey that way, and you start reading other verses in the Bible, you can kind of, you wonder sometimes, especially with Jonathan, who's Saul's son, and he's eating this honey and his countenance becomes enlightened, and then he goes on to win this battle. This might have been a kind of drug for combat, and Jonathan and his soldiers might have taken this and kind of gone forward into and won this battle that way.
With David and Jonathan and their very special relationship, and they're out with the boys, I think of Mel Brooks, this Robin Hood movie, Men in Tights. I don't know.
Sure, it's a bromance. It's a bromance. It's
no evidence that they had more, that it was more than it could be they were lovers, which is fine. But that maybe they were really, they were definitely very close.
Yeah, I think the Greeks were that way, weren't they? Or at least some groups of the Greeks were. Yeah. So Men that could be Men in Tights, exactly. Yep.
I got that sound in my head.
Yep. But I guess David also kind of plays a lot of music for Saul, and Saul has these like bipolar manic episodes, and he's kind of like going crazy at one point. And so, maybe he's taking too many mushrooms. He's kind of losing his shit. That might have been one.
He's like, we're talking about the Sopranos. Saul is like Tony Soprano, because one minute he wants to whack David, and the next minute he's, I love you.
Yeah, exactly.
And you never know what he's coming from. So,
Yep.
So that's, I mean, that story of David and Saul is I'm still amazed. It's very modern. It's got all the vibes of a soap opera, and some of the arguments are very modern. Like David's sister, like you said, will say something, he'll turn around and say, "What's it to you?" and walk away. You don't think ancient people talking where women and men are just fighting and having affairs on each other. It's an amazing story. I love that story. It's just
wonderful. That's it's really interesting, huh? It's like a soap opera in a way. It's like a soap opera, really. Lots of drama, lots. It's
good lessons. It's got everything. So
kudos
whoever wrote it.
Yeah. No kidding. Yeah.
I saw a question in here about is there a psychoactive honey? And I took a quick look on the web, and apparently bees have been known to consume mycelium from mushrooms. So if you had hives of bees near where the psilocybin mushrooms were growing, I could see very well the possibility that you could get psilocybin honey, which is exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, sure. That could be. Yeah, that could definitely be the case. Yeah, and there's actually
Awesome.
some. Yeah. Oh, there's. I'll just mention this one last thing related to the milk and honey thing. Um, there's some things in like Greek mythology too that seem to echo this as well, which is kind of interesting. I don't really touch on it in my book, but those of you who are interested in looking at this stuff, you can find it in some Greek mythology too. So
Awesome. Yeah, and I think for the going back to the burning bush, someone said it was an acacia bush, which might have gotten them high. But now also the other, again, high or 60,000 foot. I don't know what the term is, but that you see throughout the Old Testament is the anointed one. People are getting anointed with oils, and that's where we get the term the Messiah. Um, Even some
Yep.
have wondered, as we were talking last night, Vance, how there in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, Jesus is out with an oil curing the sick. So tell us about this mysterious oil that was so important to the Hebrews and the Jews, which might have done more than just made you smell right or whatever.
Right. Well, actually, Danny Nemu could probably do a better job of this than I can, to be honest, because I basically just kind of briefly reference him and say he says some really cool stuff about this, and I kind of move on quick because he does a good job of doing all the chemical analysis stuff. That's kind of interesting. Basically, Danny's theory is that Dr. Nemu's theory. Sorry, I don't. Maybe I'm being too personal. His theory is that this might have been like a kind of drug concoction of some sort that used cannabis and maybe some other things, and it was absorbed through the skin, essentially. And there was some synergistic effects of cinnamon and a few other things involved in the anointing oil that would have facilitated the absorption through the skin and the acting on the nervous system, essentially. So that's one possibility, that anointing oil was a kind of, it didn't just make you smell good, although that was a bonus kind of side effect. Right. It was a way to, it was a way to get connected to the Most High. That's what it was. So yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
All right, and give us evidence. So let's get to Solomon, who allegedly wrote Song of Songs, although probably not, but whatever. But where do we
Sure.
find the mushroom in there? And as some have told me, Song of Songs is history's first soft porn.
Yeah, pretty
It's
much.
pretty dirty. It's very dirty again.
Yeah.
When you see
yeah.
you look at the Old Testament with the right eyes, it's a fun book.
it's
Getting
really something.
stoned and dancing and having sex is like,
It's
Yahweh, you're pretty cool.
yeah. It's all about fertility, and fertility is about sex. That's what it's, so it was all kind of this all this symbolism of fertility and taking drugs. It was all kind of synergistic to these early groups. It was perceived even in some ways as a kind of sublime virtue, to be someone who's kind of, in a good mood and, getting laid. This was like what it meant to be rich and to have a good life to these people, pretty much. And, that's kind of, that was the way that they looked at it, at least, I think.
They were communing with the spirits at all times. They knew ecstatic rituals, and it would expand their consciousness, or they would be better artists, better caretakers of civilization, or
Yeah.
be connected more to the land.
Yes, and it definitely that side of things too. It's not all about just getting laid, but yes, it was about living responsible and ethical lives too, in a respect as well. So, the Song of Songs is an interesting verse. You kind of have to read through it, I think, in order to really get much out of it, because it's really dense, and I do the best I can to interpret it. But essentially, what you have is this kind of sacred harlot, I guess you could say. This character who seems to be a kind of prostitute in Solomon's song, that Solomon is kind of singing through. He's using her as the voice of the sacred feminine, which is kind of a strange, kind of like paradoxical thing. And this sacred harlot is basically singing the praises of all these different drugs in the Middle East. She's talking about poppies. She's talking about Egyptian lilies. She's talking about psilocybin mushrooms, ergot, and she does it poetically, or Solomon does it poetically through the voice of this woman in this story. So you have to read through it to get all the details, but it's really very paradoxical, very interesting. So it's not like this totally judgmental view of this kind of sexual promiscuity. It's a little bit judgmental of it, but at the same time it's kind of not. It's kind of strange. So you have to read through that, I guess, to really get the meaning of it. But that's the Song of Solomon. I don't know, maybe there's something else you wanted to touch on there. I don't know. So.
No, that was it, and I think you're right. I think that we have maybe perhaps even a hidden goddess. You had Anat or Ashira, and they're more visceral or primordial aspects. I think we can see a lot of, again, you're starting to see in all these places the goddess is slowly being hidden, especially the more powerful sexual and warlike goddess, like Anat. I mean, I think your book includes the cycle of Baal, which is an amazing story where Baal is killed by the death god Mot, and then Anat mourns him, and it's really beautiful. But then she has to go down and fight to get Baal out of the underworld.
Right. Yeah. And there's I've heard some interesting things that Anat might also be kind of an origin point of Athena. There's kind of a similar linguistic thing there.
100% right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So, yeah, this kind of warrior goddess woman. It's kind of interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. Sure. She's like kind of. But again, this kind of goddess wasn't good for civilization. It's good for, like you said, an agricultural, holistic, nature-loving, but not a place where you had street lights and nice architecture and 9 to 5 kind of stuff.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe that's the case. Yeah, I don't know. One thing I think we might have missed was the moon symbolism. I kind of wanted to get to that since we're kind of on this sacred feminine thing.
Yeah, and I know some have associated Abraham with the moon god too. But
yes, yeah, and there's an excerpt that's from Terence that Terence kind of ties in this interesting thing to Abraham and this whole this moon cult from Sumeria that worshiped this moon goddess named, or I think he was a masculine moon god named Sin. And this is actually the wilderness of Sin is the place where the Israelites find the manna, which is interesting. So this moon god named Sin, I do have an image for this. If you pull up image, there's a couple of 13s there, but the third number 13 will be the cylinders.
All right, let me get the right one. Share. Let's see. I got.
How do you spell that, Adam? SYNN, or how's that spelled?
It's actually spelled SIN.
Really?
Yep. Right. Yeah, it's just like the bad thing that you're not supposed to do, sin. Yeah.
Is that it, or is it the other 13?
An unlucky god named that, huh?
Oh, sorry, it's the one to the right of that. Yep. The other way. But that's an important image too that we might show. No, you had it. You had it for a second. There it is. Yep. Oh, we're getting there.
This
wonderful.
One?
Yep. Okay, so yeah, these cylinders are these old Sumerian cylinders of this moon god named Sin, and you can see that he's got this hat on. It's like this mushroom hat, and Terence McKenna references this cylinder actually in Food of the Gods, and he talks about how Abraham kind of came out of this region where this god was worshipped, in a place called Haran, I guess. So that's another point that shows that Abraham might have been part of this mushroom cult that originated in Sumeria as well. So, it's happening all over the place in the Middle East, really, and throughout the Fertile Crescent. But anyways, so the Israelites, when they're kind of in their nomadic period after crossing the Red Sea, they're in this place called the Wilderness of Sin. And this means the wilderness of the moon is what it means, essentially. And the Egyptians actually called this territory the domain of Osiris Ea, I guess. And Ea is this Egyptian lunar goddess. So it's another moon goddess going on in this same place. So a question that you might ask is, okay, so why are these people obsessed with the moon over here? What's going on? And this kind of ties into the crossing of the Red Sea, which the crossing of the Red Sea there may have been a kind of tidal passageway that opened up with the opening and closing of the tides, essentially. And so in this area, you would have had this moon cult that worshiped the moon because the moon indicated when they would be able to cross over the Red Sea into Egypt. So it would have been basically a monthly passageway that would open up for about a day or so, that people could cross over and take the shortcut into Egypt and do trade and all this stuff. So that's why you would have this cult of this moon god or this moon goddess. And essentially, this is what would have caused the Red Sea to part. It would have been this moon, the cycle of the moon, essentially. And my theory for what Yahweh means is that it is a syncretism of Ea, the lunar goddess of Egypt, with a Hebrew term which is way, which means to blow. And so Yahweh would literally mean the moon blows. The moon blows the waters away and saves the Israelites. That's what it means. And so that's the whole moon symbolism that I wanted to share with you earlier, Vance. We kind of got ahead to other things.
So, yeah, thanks. That's interesting.
Yeah, so we got to it. Cool. I don't know.
So if you get caught between the moon and
I don't know.
And Stins, I don't know.
Meadowlands, that part's all the time.
Yeah. The best you can do is get stoned or something like that.
Yep.
Oh boy, I'm full of it tonight. Well, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's a weird theory, and I don't know. There's some cool documentaries you can watch about this. Ron Wyatt was this really fringe guy from I think maybe the 70s or 80s or something, who did this really fringe biblical archaeology, and basically everyone thinks that he was a kook and a crackpot, but apparently he did these excavations, quote unquote. He conducted some dives in the Red Sea and found these weird chariot wheels and overgrown by coral and stuff in the Red Sea. And it was really kind of popular talk back in the day. It was on ABC News and all that stuff, but it's kind of interesting stuff to look at. I don't know if there's been too much more research there though, because of his reputation as a scholar. People haven't gone back there and looked at it. And so it'd be kind of cool to see a modern documentary done on that, something 20 years later, see if, I don't know, more footage or something, but yeah.
And this is to prove that the Egyptians got drowned in the Red Sea, basically.
Right. And apparently these chariot wheels can be dated to I think it's the 18th dynasty or something, because they were four-spoked or whatever. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Awesome. God, there's so much. Yeah, so much to discover.
Yes.
And
yes.
how things change on a dime. I mean, I used to think Moses was pretty much fictional, but then you read the work of Gary Greenberg. Remember his interview? He makes such a good case that either he was Akhenaten or a priest of Akhenaten. I know, Vance, you definitely subscribe to that, and I started too. Yep. So there might be more to it. And I thought Solomon and David were probably fictional. Now I think they were sort of David was some bandit lord and Solomon was some magician. He probably was some shaman or magician, but everything got embellished.
Yeah.
There are people back there, and there's some people that did amazing things back there, whether or not we know their real names or whether they're composites or what, right?
Right. Yep. Yeah. It's so old. It's hard to tell, but yeah, it's interesting to see all the scholarship come together. It's just so interesting with the internet and all of the programs that you guys are doing too. It's really cool to see just that, people get to kind of build on top of everything that we're kind of all sharing. It's really interesting, I think,
Yeah. And for the audience, when you get the audio version, I'm going to go ahead and put as a bonus, our old interview with Danny Nemu. Well, it's only a couple of years old, but that way it'll be a good compliment, since Danny compliments a lot what you say, but he does more ayahuasca and cannabis too. But I think
right.
And then the audience can make up their minds, because
Sure. Yep. That's just. Yep.
All right. Well, we want to get to Atlantis, because I love your work with Atlantis, and I thought what an amazing argument. Most people think old Atlantis was in the middle of the Atlantic, probably by the Azores or west of Portugal, around that area, maybe Gibraltar. But you say that that might not be the case, Adam.
Well, it's a guess, it's a guess, but
argument.
Yeah. So essentially, again, I kind of take a lot of popular theories actually and kind of mix and mash them up. So, it's not necessarily like my idea or anything. I don't want to give people that impression because I'm finding things too online and, just putting things together in different ways maybe, but
synthesis.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. But I kind of go with the whole Ricat structure idea. There's a couple of reasons I think it's kind of attractive. And I guess one image you might want to show would be, sorry, there's two 29.5s in there, but 29.5's Ricat.
All right, let me pull it up.
Yeah, that's just one simple image to kind of give people a sense of what it looks
like. Okay, I see it.
Yep.
There's Atlantis fictional. You want the Ricat one, right?
Either one. Yeah. We can show both of them.
Yeah, then we'll move to the slides. All right.
So yeah, you got the whole fiction, the kind of recreation of Plato's Atlantis there. It's got these kind of two rings of land and 3 rings of water, and you have the central island in the middle, and that's kind of how Plato tells us how Atlantis would have looked. And then in the Ricat structure, kind of looks a little bit similar. It's much larger, I think, in scale than the old Atlantis, according to Plato. But yeah, so this is 34 kilometers across, according to that measurement I made on Google Earth. So yeah, you can see that it kind of has this similar structure. You might have some spots that are eroded there, but
and where is this?
And this is in Africa, in the Sahara, in Mauritania. Yeah. So that's another reason why I think it makes sense to think of Atlantis in the Sahara, because if this was where civilization started, it's reasonable that you have some civilizations start in Egypt, and then maybe on the West Coast you'd have something, right in this area, really. Why not? And it's pretty close to the coast. So again, going back 10,000 years before some kind of flood event, who knows? Maybe this was underwater at some point.
But we have evidence that the Sahara was a different place than thousands of years ago, right?
Yes. It's pretty much agreed upon that pretty much the whole Sahara was covered in rivers and lakes and in grassland, essentially. And you'd have these glaciers covering Europe, essentially. So the habitable land would have just basically shifted south, is basically probably what would have happened. So if that's the case, you have these hominids evolving in the Sahara, then you might have, something like this. It's hard to imagine, but you can see, looking at our civilization, we've gone from, it's only been 3,000 years since King Solomon. So, so we've had 3 moments from King Solomon to us, going back 10,000 years. It's, who knows what could have been made, it's hard to say. And this image is kind of interesting, but it gets into a whole different layer of this. I don't know how quickly you want to move through.
Okay. Take your time, whatever.
Sure.
As fast as you want to go.
Yeah. So these are the territories in the Mediterranean basin that Plato says were colonized by the Atlanteans. So you have in Africa pretty much up to the Nile, and then you have on the northern side of Europe going into Tuscany in Italy. And there's a couple interesting things about this. One of the most interesting things to me is the Etruscans. And I put a few Etruscan images. You can just show maybe one of them. Let me see if I can find one. Well, actually, go to the next slide. Actually, the next one's good because it shows the Phoenician, Greek, and Etruscan colonies there. Yeah, that one there. Yeah.
Etruscans, those were
Okay.
they enslaved the Romans at first, or
Yeah, so this just gives you a general picture of these kind of Phoenician and Greek colonies. What I end up doing with my Atlantis analysis is I just ask this question: if Atlantis was real and there was this colonial group all in the Mediterranean, it begs some interesting questions. You know, are some of these sites older than we thought they were? And these groups, like the Phoenicians, who kind of seem like these really early seafaring groups, uh, these groups uh, these groups might have been like kind of proto-Atlantean. Essentially, the Etruscans, the Phoenicians, even the early Greeks could have been these kind of refugees from Atlantis, essentially, who were forced to settle in the Mediterranean after their city was destroyed outside the Pillars of Heracles. And then these people would basically be responsible with kind of starting civilization. And the Phoenicians are very influential for the Israelites. So it kind of all ties back into the whole Israelite story there. It's a little bit complex, and it's a lot of information to go through, I guess. I don't know. I suppose, well, one image that might be really good to share would be the first 33 there, the Athenian Phoenician sculpture. Yeah. So this is an interesting sculpture that shows in a kind of commonality between Greek and Phoenician sculpture. So this the sculpture on the left is from Athens, and this sculpture was apparently destroyed by King Xerxes when he invaded Athens. Right. And so there were a couple sculptures in there that were destroyed. And they kind of have this very similar look to these Phoenician sculptures. And so you kind of have to ask this question. I mean, were the early Greeks more related to these Phoenicians? And something that's very interesting about these sculptures to me is that, I mean, they have this totally unique artistic appearance. I mean, they look like extraordinary and modern. And they have these dreadlocks. They have this kind of archaic smile, which to me is another like kind of goofy, drugged out kind of thing that these people are doing. It seems to me that this is a depiction of this very different like cultural attitude compared to what you see with like later Greeks and Romans. That is fundamentally, I think, psychedelic in some capacity. And it's interesting to see these Greek groups and these other groups kind of seeming to be kind of culturally related to these Phoenicians. It's a very interesting parallel. And this is kind of getting to the cusp of like my knowledge on this subject. So
yeah, you see the question, Justin saying Phoenicians were known as the purple men. It's also the root of phonetics, but you also make an argument that red is a very important color with the Phoenicians.
Yes. Yeah. And yeah, so yeah, this gets into the very interesting, peculiar part of the whole Atlantis mythology. I don't know if I put my red coloration scheme in there, but essentially the Phoenicians were famous for making this kind of purple red dye, right? It was called Tyrian purple, but sometimes it turned out kind of red, sometimes more purple. Mm-hmm. But essentially, I think that there was this interesting kind of dynamic with the Phoenicians where they were kind of into these royal bloodlines, and they were very warlike, and they made this red fabric. It seems like there was this kind of interesting kind of cultural sentiment around the color red, and you see it depicted in Etruscan art. You see it depicted in a lot of the Minoan art as well. Seems to be like a kind of even a symbol. Just this color seems to be a symbol of their kind of nationality and their culture in some way. And it's probably related to kind of warfare and these royal bloodlines. And I think that, the ancient world probably perceived color in this kind of way. This would have had some kind of significance or meaning to them in some capacity, and this would have been passed on to the Romans later. The Etruscans were kind of the predecessors of the Romans, and they're interesting too. They also have sculptures that look a lot like Phoenicians, which is kind of interesting. Mm. They look kind of African, really, and so this is it's an interesting area to look at where there's not much information. And not much like historical information. The Etruscan myths are so sparse, and it's a hard area to look at, but it's really quite interesting. And yeah, you can see
some of the art that you put up. Bob
yep.
Marley.
And Bob Marley. Yep.
Yeah, like you said, even Samson probably had dreadlocks. It was very common in those days.
Yeah, the whole dreadlock thing seemed to be a part of the kind of the whole cultural thing going on at that time. It's interesting. You have to wonder, this whole that, Greek culture, Roman culture may have been partially facilitated by these African people who came out of Egypt and maybe out of Atlantis, and colonized the Mediterranean basin, essentially. It's a possibility at the very least, I think. And I think it's worth some consideration. And you see the Sphinx the Sphinx sculptures scattered across the Mediterranean basin as well, in Greece. And this is an Etruscan example there. And these are Etruscan statues here. So you're getting a kind of brief visualization of this idea that the Mediterranean basin and basically classical civilization was started by these African and Asian groups, or at least that's one way of looking at it. And I think it's not an unreasonable way of looking at this. And yeah, that's another Greek sculpture there. You have a Spartan one here. Again, you got the dreadlocks going in the back.
Right.
It's kind of interesting to see that there's some reasons to believe in kind of some African and Asian origins in Greece and in Rome as well. So.
Very cool. Yeah, I love it. And again, so much more in the book. Well, as we start getting towards the end, Vance, any questions from the audience or yourself?
No, not really. But actually, Stephen Jefferson, otherwise known as Mark, wanted to know, Adam, have you ever heard that the Phoenicians made it over to the Americas and some of the Native Americans?
He does address, he addresses a lot in his book. But good question.
I touch on it pretty briefly. But that is really interesting. The Michigan copper thing has been talked about by people like Graham Hancock. Interesting, very interesting. I think it's definitely a plausibility that they made it over to the Americas for sure. I mean, they had wooden ships just like the Europeans back in the 1500s. I mean, so they could have made it. Why not?
Sure.
Yeah.
Also, you know about the Etruscan language, right? Do you know about that?
Briefly, I've looked at some sparse things here and there.
Is not descended from the Indo-European family of languages. That's what I know. They didn't have as far as we know, we don't have any written language. They adopt
our alphabet from the Phoenicians, right?
Yeah, and so did the Etruscans, by way of the Romans or something, or the Romans got it from the Etruscans, something like that. But the Etruscans didn't have a written language, apparently, of their own, but they had a different language than, from a different language family than European.
Yes, I've actually read something recently about this, that Etruscan might be related to Basque in some capacity as well. Yeah, and Basque, and the Basque culture is in kind of the northern part of Spain there, and that also falls within the domain of this Atlantean colonization territory that Plato talks about. So I don't
think their language is related to no European either, from what I remember. It's another mysterious language.
Yep. That's what I've heard as well. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah,
this is a blast. It's such a labyrinth, and things change. New archaeology, new insights. So, my attitude is just have fun. I mean, don't you have fun? Exactly. It's just.
So if I get disproven tomorrow, then so be it. I'm okay with it. It's not a big deal to me. So, I'm interested and curious about this stuff, and I'd like to see if we can get maybe a little bit more conversations going around about the role of psychedelics and a more open attitude about maybe African and Asian influence into the Mediterranean basin, because there's been a really strict Eurocentric view about, Greek civilization being the total origin of everything. And I think in my book, I think I do a good job of kind of dispelling some of this. I really breeze through it pretty quick here, but the book provides some pretty interesting things that don't always get talked about. So, somewhere to look if you want to investigate this more for yourself. So.
Well, you do a great job, and we appreciate it. So one more time, and again, I will have it on the show notes for the YouTube description today, tonight, or tomorrow, but definitely when it's out as a podcast and at the website. But where can people find your book, Eden and Entheogens?
Yep, you can go to Internet Archive, and you can just type that in to the search engine, and it'll bring you right there. So Eden and Entheogens. Real simple.
All right.
Yep.
Cool.
Yep.
Awesome. And do you have any other web presence? Or you?
No, I'm kind of
laying low.
I'm laying low. I don't want people to come attack me for not supporting the white race or whatever. That's
you have your
crazy
stealing the heretic of it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a heretic. So
yes.
Yeah. So I don't know, but eventually, if it's, maybe I'll make some social media thing that I do or whatever. I don't know. We'll see what happens.
And the book, and what's next to add to your book? What are you working on next?
Yeah, next. I think I'm gonna add a second volume to this. So basically what I do is I cover the Saharan grasslands period up into the time of King Solomon. And what I'm going to try to do next is go from King Solomon and then go through Christianity, Islam, and touch on the Freemasons a little bit, and even the American Revolution to some extent as well, and kind of show this continuity of this mushroom tradition that seemed to go for a long time. And yeah, I think it got to the American Revolution, which it's really far out, but it's Dennis McKenna actually posted an article on his Twitter recently that has a great article about this. So if you can scroll through Dennis McKenna's Twitter, you might find it. I don't know. It's a treasure hunt there.
Why don't I follow him on Twitter? Shame on me.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Really, yeah, I'm terrible at that.
All right. There's so many people. There's so many people to follow, honestly.
Yeah, and sometimes I wonder if they have a Twitter. I guess that's my Gen X brain thinking.
Oh, no, yeah.
No. All right. Well, this has been awesome. We are at the end. Great conversation. Please support independent researchers like Adam. Please support this show in any way you can. We have some great shows coming up. I think we will be having shows on, I should know, unless I've taken some shrooms. But our next show will deal with Jung and his black books. We'll have shows on Blavatsky, Hermetic philosophy, the Sethians. So we will have some amazing topics in these strange times, because we need that old time gnosis to get us by. But I appreciate everybody from the chat room who's been there. Your company, your remarks make me laugh. Good questions. But first of all, Vance, thanks for joining us. And I see you're back in Atlantis, way down below the ocean.
Way down to the bottom of the ocean with Donovan. Oh, you're very welcome. And this is good, Adam. Great job. I really saw, what you were talking about there. We didn't have time to do it to justice, of course, but it's very, very solid stuff, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we do the best we can, and that's what we can do. So, thanks, guys. It's been great. I mean, it's been a blast. Thank you so much. Yeah,
we love what you're doing, Adam. Thanks, and we definitely look forward to having you back on in the future, talking about Freemasons, American Revolution, and all the shenanigans they were into.
That would be fun, man. That would be fun.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Adam. Appreciate your company. And for the audience, thanks for being here. Thanks for being yourself, your true self, here in the desert of the real, which at some point wasn't a desert. It was full of crops and mushrooms and sheep.
The wilderness of the real.
Yep.
But anyways, I always say hello and goodbye, and really appreciate it. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.